The high-definition glow of my phone screen illuminated the dark living room. On the live feed, Kimberly bypassed the potted ferns with practiced ease and approached the hidden safe in my pantry. She wasn't looking for misplaced keys. I watched, breath steady and pulse calm, as her manicured fingers extracted the emerald brooch that had belonged to my grandmother. She was securing her centerpiece for the city's most prestigious gala. She was so blinded by her own entitlement that she didn't even consider who might recognize it, the very people who knew it belonged in our family archives. I didn't cry. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. Have you ever felt like you were living with a stranger who claimed to be family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. The moment the digital timestamp marked 11:51 at night, I opened my laptop and began drafting the formal legal complaint. There was no internal debate, no lingering hope that this was a misunderstanding. This was not a breakdown. It was a balance sheet, and the accounts were finally being reconciled. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, funding the illusion of their grandeur while rendering myself completely invisible. The carriage house I lived in, tucked away at the edge of the sprawling estate, wasn't just a quaint residence. It was a physical manifestation of my silent labour. Every structural repair, from the reinforced roof trusses to the upgraded plumbing, had been paid for entirely out of my own pocket. I poured tens of thousands of dollars into maintaining a property that served only to elevate their social standing. I had been foolish enough to pour tens of thousands into the estate, naively assuming that my role as a contributor granted me some form of implicit equity, but I had no formal contract to protect me. While they hosted lavish garden parties and ordered imported caviar to impress their hollow circle of friends, I was patching drywall and quietly covering the property tax increases. My life was deliberately modest. I bought my clothes off the rack, cooked my own meals, and drove a 7-year-old sedan. In stark contrast, my family's lifestyle was defined by gluttony and a desperate need for external validation. They consumed resources, like a fire consumes oxygen. My mother Kimberly and my brother Matthew operated under the unspoken assumption that my earnings were communal property, a slush fund designed to keep their high society masquerade afloat. Love in this household had never been a bond. It had been a subscription, with me perpetually footing the bill. Every emotional crisis they manufactured, every financial shortfall they encountered due to their own reckless spending, I had absorbed without complaint. I provided the emotional labour of a therapist and the financial backing of an endless credit line, entirely for free. But watching that crystal-clear security footage severed the final, fraying thread of obligation. The theft of my grandmother's emerald brooch wasn't just an invasion of privacy. It was a declaration of absolute entitlement. They believed everything I owned, everything I cherished, was theirs for the taking. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon some semblance of familial regret, but there was only cold, hard clarity. They had weaponized my loyalty against me for the last time. The silent investor was pulling her funding, effective immediately, and I was going to ensure the bankruptcy of their social empire was thoroughly documented. The following morning, the atmosphere in the main house was thick with the scent of freshly brewed espresso and the suffocating weight of denial. I found my brother, Matthew, casually scrolling through his phone at the granite kitchen island. I didn't raise my voice. I simply placed a printed screenshot of the security footage on the counter, right next to his imported pastry. I asked him directly about the missing items, demanding an explanation for the blatant intrusion into my home. Matthew didn't even flinch. He glanced at the paper, rolled his eyes, and offered a dismissive smirk. He told me I was being overly dramatic, and claimed she was just checking the humidity levels in the pantry to make sure the dry goods weren't spoiling. It was a lie so absurd, so profoundly insulting to my intelligence, that it perfectly encapsulated our entire family dynamic. This is the trap of cruel normalization. When you are raised in an environment where boundaries are treated as personal insults and exploitation is framed as familial duty, the abnormal becomes the baseline. You are conditioned to doubt your own reality. For 3 decades, Matthew and Kimberly had seamlessly operated within this system, they engaged in a persistent, subtle campaign of gaslighting, systematically eroding my perception of what was acceptable. Whenever I attempted to assert a limit, I was labelled the problematic one, the selfish daughter, the uncooperative sister. The trap is designed to make the victim feel like the aggressor simply for saying no. They normalise the cruelty by wrapping it in the language of concern and family unity. But staring at Matthew's smug, unbothered expression, the fog completely lifted. I finally saw the architecture of their abuse with absolute precision. This wasn't a family. It was a parasitic organism, and I was the host. Matthew's refusal to acknowledge the reality of the theft wasn't just him defending our mother. It was a desperate attempt to maintain the power structure that allowed him to live a life of unearned privilege. He needed me to accept his ridiculous excuse because the alternative required him to face his own complicity in my exploitation. I didn't argue with him. I didn't try to make him understand. Arguing implies a negotiation, and my boundaries were no longer up for discussion. I simply took the printed screenshot back, turned on my heel, and walked out. The era of my forced participation in their shared delusion was officially over. I had a schedule to keep. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, I was seated in a leather chair at a sleek, glass-panelled law firm overlooking the riverfront. The air conditioning hummed quietly, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the family estate. Sitting across from my attorney, a woman who specialised in unravelling complex domestic financial entanglements, I felt entirely in my element. This was where the emotion evaporated, replaced entirely by strategy and documented facts. I opened my briefcase and began placing the evidence onto the polished mahogany desk with the precision of a dealer dealing cards. First came the tax receipts. Years and years of highlighted bank statements proving that every single property tax increase for the entire estate had been paid from my personal accounts. Next came the maintenance records for the carriage house, a mountain of invoices detailing over $85,000 in structural upgrades, plumbing overhauls, and electrical work. Then, I slid across a certified copy of the original home deed, a document that clearly defined the boundaries of my legal residence and established my unquestionable rights as a tenant and contributor. Finally, I handed over the flash drive containing the unedited, high-definition footage from the Pantry. My attorney plugged it in, watching in silence as the screen displayed Kimberly executing her calculated theft. The visual evidence was indisputable. We weren't having a tearful conversation about betrayal. We were conducting a forensic audit of their liability. I instructed her to draft a formal cease and desist letter effective immediately. This document would officially prohibit Kimberly and Matthew from setting foot on the carriage house property, demanding the immediate return of the emerald brooch, and serving notice that all financial subsidies were permanently terminated. The shift was absolute. I was taking our conflict out of the shadows of the living room and thrusting it into the harsh, unforgiving light of the legal system. They had always relied on the assumption that I would prioritize family secrecy over my own protection. They banked on my silence to maintain their facade. By retaining counsel and putting everything on the official record, I was neutralizing their only weapon. This was the professional escalation. There would be no more quiet arguments or passive-aggressive dinners. From this moment forward, they would not be dealing with their compliant sister or dutiful daughter. They would be dealing with my legal representation, and the currency of our relationship was no longer guilt. It was consequences. The meeting was nearing its conclusion when my attorney paused, her eyes narrowing as she reviewed a secondary file I had requested from the estate liquidator, a sharp-eyed 72-year-old woman named Amanda Cole. Amanda had been assisting me with appraising my grandmother's separate assets, and she had flagged an anomaly in the archival paperwork. My attorney pulled a faded yellow document from the manila folder and slid it across the desk toward me. It was a withdrawal slip from a secure banking institution, dated nearly a decade ago. I stared at the paper, the clinical coldness in my chest solidifying into something entirely uncompromising. The document detailed the complete liquidation of a private educational grant fund, a fund set up exclusively in my name by my grandmother to ensure I could pursue advanced degrees without financial burden. The amount withdrawn was substantial, completely draining the account. But what held my gaze wasn't the zero balance. It was the signature on the bottom line. It was my name, but the handwriting belonged unmistakably to Kimberly. The looping curves and sharp angles of the letters were a perfect match for the woman who had spent my entire life dictating my worth. She hadn't just stolen jewelry. She had systemically robbed me of my future, forging my signature to siphon off an educational legacy meant to secure my independence. She had taken those funds to finance a massive, unnecessary renovation of the main estate solarium, just so she could host the spring charity luncheon. The stakes of this war shifted instantly. This was no longer a simple domestic squabble over a stolen brooch or a boundary dispute. The revelation elevated her actions from petty theft to an indictable felony fraud. The statute of limitations had not expired, because the discovery of the crime had only just occurred. Thanks to the mountain of clear, irrefutable evidence I had already compiled, my attorney successfully petitioned for an expedited review of the felony fraud charges, bypassing the typical months-long backlog. My attorney looked at me, a silent question in her eyes, waiting to see if the weight of this discovery would break my resolve. Instead, I felt an incredible surge of power. The smoking gun had just been placed directly into my hands. They weren't shocked by what they'd done over the years. They were about to be shocked that I had stopped playing along. I instructed my attorney to immediately forward the forged documents to the local prosecutor's office. There would be no warnings, no ultimatums, and absolutely no opportunity for them to spin a narrative. 2 days later, a black sedan pulled into the gravel driveway. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, not with a badge, but with a thick, official-looking document folder. It was a process server, hired by my firm, accompanied by a notary public to witness the formal delivery of the legal injunction. Kimberly marched out to meet us, her chin held high, ready to use her usual volume and performative outrage to intimidate me, fully expecting me to back down under the weight of her presence. She started her rehearsed routine, loudly accusing me of being mentally unstable, but the process server didn't even blink. He didn't care about her yelling. He simply held out the file and stated clearly, "Kimberly, you are hereby served with an emergency restraining order and a formal notice of an ongoing criminal fraud investigation regarding forged bank documents. You are legally prohibited from stepping foot on this property." The shift was instant. The smugness drained from Matthew's face, and Kimberly's performance died in her throat. She looked at the official seal on the documents, and the reality of her legal jeopardy hit her like a physical blow. She realized that I hadn't brought a fight. I had brought the final judgment, right there on the porch, under the harsh glare of the driveway lights and the watchful eyes of the neighbors. Her social empire didn't just crack, it shattered. The aftermath of that night on the porch was swift and devastating for the people who had once called themselves my family. The local prosecutor did not hesitate to move forward with the felony fraud charges regarding the stolen educational grant. Faced with overwhelming, irrefutable documentary evidence and the high-definition footage of the Pantry theft, Kimberly's high-priced defense attorney advised her to take a plea deal to avoid the absolute certainty of a prison sentence. The terms of her probation were incredibly strict, but the legal consequences were mild compared to the social execution she endured. The city's elite circle, a group entirely dependent on appearances and unblemished reputations, excised her with ruthless efficiency. The invitations to galas stopped arriving. Her position on the charity boards was quietly but firmly revoked. The grand estate, completely unsustainable without my silent financial subsidies, was put on the market within 6 months. Matthew, suddenly forced to support himself without the endless safety net of my bank accounts, found himself working a mid-level administrative job, entirely stripped of his unearned arrogance. Their social exile was permanent and complete. As for me, I remained in the carriage house just long enough to oversee its sale, liquidating the asset and reaching a legal settlement that accounted for my capital contributions to the property. With the funds from the property sale and the court-mandated restitution for the forged grant money securely in my accounts, I relocated to a quiet, sunlit home on the opposite side of the state. I finally possessed the one thing they had desperately tried to keep from me: genuine peace. I was entirely free from the shadow of their pearls and the suffocating weight of their manufactured dramas. Through this entire process, I learned the profound necessity of reclaiming the narrative through sacred distance. When you are entangled with people who view you only as a resource, proximity is poison. They will constantly attempt to rewrite history, to gaslight you into believing that your reactions are the problem, rather than their initial abuse. Sacred distance isn't just about physical miles, it is the establishment of an impenetrable emotional firewall. It is the conscious, deliberate choice to stop participating in their reality. By stepping away, you reclaim the power to define your own truth. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. I've come to realize that family is not an obligation defined by blood. It is a privilege earned through mutual respect and reciprocal care. The cold, methodical dismantling of their control over my life was not an act of malice. It was a necessary amputation to save myself from their infection. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. And my freedom looks like an empty driveway, a quiet morning, and the absolute certainty that I will never be used again. If this story opened your eyes to the power of setting boundaries, please share this video. Your story deserves to be heard, and your peace is not up for negotiation.